Good morning and hafa to the people of Guam. We are here for a public hearing on Resolution 117-38. I'd like to welcome my colleagues, Senator Sabina Perez, as well as members of the community for coming to this public hearing. At this time, I'd like to call up the people that are willing to testify to come up and sit before us, and we will begin our proceedings. So if you're interested in testifying, please grab a seat up at the front here. And just a few rules of engagement before we start. This is a cordial public hearing, so do our best to always keep our comments above the belt and respectful of one another, and we'll generally play it pretty open with giving you guys as much time as you need to testify. Before I would open up the floor to testimony, I'd like to just begin with my opening statement, and then we will hear from the panel before I'll open it up to my colleagues for questions and comments of their own. So thank you all again for being here this morning. I want to begin by noting that prior to scheduling this hearing, I met with representatives of the Guam Association of Realtors, including leadership within that organization, to hear their perspective on this resolution. They took the time to share their views candidly and professionally, and I want to state for the record that I took what they said seriously and in good faith. But after listening carefully, I still believe that it was important and frankly necessary to hold a public hearing. Because housing policy does not belong to any one group. It belongs to everyone that lives here. And it would not be fair, responsible, or democratic to rely on one perspective alone when the issue before us affects tenants, families, military households, landlords, employers, and the long-term future of Guam's communities. And so that's why we are here today, to hear from everyone. I also want to be clear at the outset about what this resolution is and what it is not. This resolution does not mandate a change in federal policy. It does not rewrite federal law. What it does do is express the opinion of this legislature on a question that the Department of War itself has been studying for more than a decade. A yes vote on this resolution would express the legislature's support for transitioning Guam from the Overseas Housing Allowance system to the Basic Allowance for housing system. A no vote would just as clearly express the legislature's disapproval of such a change. Either way, the outcome of this resolution is a message, a formal statement of the preferences of the elected representatives of the people of Guam to the Department of War as it continues to consider this issue. And that matters. That in and of itself matters, to let the Department of War know what we want to do here as a local community, whether it be a yes or a no. Colleagues, the primary driver behind this resolution is simple and urgent. Housing on Guam has become increasingly unaffordable, and rents have risen at an alarming rate in recent years. Families are paying more and getting less. Young people are doubling up. Essential workers are being priced out of the communities they serve. Seniors on fixed incomes are struggling to stay housed. And all of this is happening now. I have supported measures from my colleagues from both sides of the aisle on legislation aimed at addressing housing affordability, increasing the supply, and removing barriers to construction. I intend to continue to support any serious good faith effort to expand housing supply and address the structural shortage we face. Because make no mistake, Guam has a housing shortage. And that shortage has been significantly exacerbated by the scale and pace of the military buildup. Over the past decade, Guam has been asked to absorb thousands of additional service members, dependents, civilian contractors, and construction workers. That growth in population has driven a sharp increase in demand for rental housing. Demand that has not kept pace with supply. The Department of War has authority over its own housing decisions. Yet the buildup has proceeded without a commensurate increase in on-base housing capacity sufficient to absorb the additional demand being placed on the civilian market. As a result, more and more military households are pushed off base and into the private rental market, competing directly with local families for a limited number of units. That context matters. Now, layered on top of the supply shortage is the way military housing, the allowances in particular, are structured on Guam. Service members stationed here receive housing assistance under the Overseas Housing Allowance, or OHA. Unlike the Basic Allowance for housing used in the 50 states, OHA is a dollar-for-dollar reimbursement system. It reimburses actual rent and utilities up to a maximum ceiling. And that ceiling is not arbitrary. According to the Department of War, OHA rates are set based on the 80th percentile of reported rents. In other words, they are deliberately set high to cover the most expensive portion of the market. In 2013, the Department of the Navy commissioned a 122-page study by the Center for Naval Analysis titled "Evaluating Which Housing Allowance System is Best for U.S. Territories," a comparison of OHA and BAH. This was not a local study. It was not advocacy on any side of the aisle. It was a federally funded technical analysis requested by the Department of War itself. And that study reached a critical conclusion. It found that, quote, whereas OHA has had negligible effects on markets in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, it has had major effects on Guam. Sit on that word, major effects. CNA documented that military renters dominate the high end of Guam's rental market. It found that landlords are legally permitted to price rentals based on a service member's rank and dependent status. And it concluded that because of these dynamics, a normal market price for housing may not currently exist on Guam. That is not my language. That is the language of the Department of War's own contractor. The study also found that under OHA, service members have no incentive to bargain for lower rents because they do not keep the savings if they rent below the maximum. As a result, a large share of OHH user pay rents clustered at or near the maximum allowable amount. CNA further concluded that transitioning Guam to a BAH would result in lower overall housing allowance costs for the Department of War, estimating approximately 6% in savings, while introducing free market incentives that are absent under OHA. BAH, as used in the 50 states, is a flat allowance. If a service member rents for less than that allowance, they get to keep the difference. That structure is key. That structure encourages negotiation, price sensitivity, and competition. Colleagues, this is not about blaming military families. They are acting completely rationally under the system they are given. It is not about blaming landlords. They are responding rationally to the incentives in the market. The question before us is whether the system itself makes sense for Guam. Whether a reimbursement model designed for overseas postings combined with a large-scale military buildup and insufficient on-base housing has contributed to the severe pressure we see today in our rental market. And whether the people of Guam should have a say in how that system affects their daily lives. This resolution does not claim that changing from OHA to BHA to BAH will magically solve our housing crisis. It will not. We still need more housing. We still need zoning reform, infrastructure investment, streamlined permitting, and public-private partnerships. But we cannot ignore a federal policy that the Department of War itself has identified as uniquely distorting Guam's market. Holding this hearing is about transparency. It is about hearing from tenants who are struggling, from families who are stretched thin, from industry participants, from economists, and from anyone who wants their voice on the record. At the end of this process, however the vote falls, whether it is a yes or a no, the legislature will have spoken. And the Department of War will know clearly and formally where the elected representatives of the people of Guam stand. That is our role. That is our responsibility. And I look forward to hearing from all who have taken the time to participate today. I appreciate you all for coming, and I thank you all for being here. So, Sidzus Maasi, at this time, I'd like to open up the floor for testimony. We'll start with you, sir, because I know that you were here first. We'll go from you further down the table. So at this time, just before you start testimony, introduce yourself and who you are representing, and then the floor is yours, sir.
Good morning, Senators. My name is Monty McDowell. I'm the Principal Broker of Advanced Management. I'm the Guam Association of Realtors Chairman of the Government Affairs Committee, and I'm here on behalf of the Guam Association of Realtors to testify against Resolution 117-38. Before I get started, I just want to make a couple comments. One is, many years ago, I remember our Congresswoman, Madeline Medalio, discussing with the Guam Chamber when I was chairman of it about the importance of Guam being in a united front when we want change made that requires federal government's action. And says too often the legislature says one thing, the governor says anything, or says something different, the chamber may say something. We need to have a united front. As we speak here, those people that met with you, Senator Parkinson, in your office, most of them are in Washington, D.C. today, meeting with our legislators on the federal side, as they do every year about this time. And they'll be professing many issues that deal with real estate issues. And I'm sure this type of issue will come up, and we'll profess exactly what we professed in your office, that OHA is the way to stay. It is now, and it should stay that way. And so I'll proceed with the testimony in opposition of Resolution 117-38, relative to urging the United States Congress and Department of Defense. I apologize, I use the Department of Defense. I'm a 22-year veteran of the United States Navy, and I have a hard time changing my way. It's Department of War, I do know that.
I know it's tough, but it's certainly a more honest title.
To transition Guam from Overseas Housing Allowance, OHA, to Base Allowance for Housing, BHA. The Guam Association of Realtors represents real estate professionals who work daily with Guam renters, landlords, property managers, and home buyers. We share the community's deep concern about housing affordability and supply. However, GAR respectfully opposes resolution number 117-38 and urges the legislature not to advocate for a wholesale shift from OHA to BHA in Guam at this time. Guam acknowledges the housing crisis, but a rushed OHA to BHA change can worsen workforce housing scarcity. Resolution 117-38 correctly recognizes the severity of Guam's housing conditions. Median home price commonly cited in the resolution range from $600,000 to $800,000, and it states that more than half of Guam households are housing cost burdened, spending more than 30% of income on shelter. The resolution also points to extremely high rental conditions. HUD fair market rents above $2,100 a month. Guam Housing Authority occupancy near 99%, and examples of two-bedroom units renting for $1,250 to civilian tenants, but $2,450 plus the service members who rents track OHA ceilings. GAR's concern is this: that $1,250 to $2,000 rentals are precisely the housing stock most civilian families rely on. Shifting from BHA would create a strong financial incentive for service members to compete for that same workforce stock, reducing availability for local families in the very segment where vacancy is already near zero. 2, the incentive structure is the core issue. BHA encourages downshifting to cheaper units and pocketing the difference. The CNA report explains the fundamental differences in incentives. BHA is a cash payment. Service members can spend more or less than the allowance and keep remaining funds. It can result in some choosing housing the military considers inadequate, which is permissible under BHA. OHA is reimbursable based. It generally reimburses actual cost up to a cap and requires documentation of housing expenses. Even Senator Parkinson's own materials describe BHA as a flat allowance where service members can keep leftover funds, an approach that naturally encourages seeking cheaper housing to retain savings. CNA further states that because OHA reimburses actual costs, it may encourage service members to live in higher quality housing than they would otherwise choose under BHA. A portion of service members will prefer to move to less expensive housing and keep the difference as cash. The service member is exactly why, the mechanism is exactly why GAR is concerned on Guam. Less expensive housing is not an abstract category. It is the same apartment condo inventory the civilian residents depend on. 3, the CNA report documents that military renters already concentrate in higher end housing, and that separation matters. CNA found Guam's market is different, in part because the military dominates higher end segment. The report cites the 2009 Guam Comprehensive Housing Study and on-island observation that high-end condos are disproportionately occupied by military personnel, including one beachfront high-rise where staff reported roughly 80% of residents were military. The same 2009 study cited the CNA found the median military renter spent about 90% more on rent than the median non-military renter. CNA also reported roughly 2,400 active service members renting in Guam's private sector, December 2012 data, and it used multiple listing service listings and island vacancy rates to estimate that military service members could account for over half of occupancy in high-end rental units in the OHA price range. GAR's position is straightforward. This concentration in higher cost military appropriate rentals helps reduce direct competition between federally subsidized renters and local working families for entry-level and mid-market rentals. A shift to BHA would predictably push demand downward into the workforce market. 4, CNA provides Guam-specific evidence that BHA will be lower and many households will trade down in size price. CNA concludes there is one thing they can say with certainty: future BAH rates will be lower than current OHA rates, in part because of smaller BAH housing standards and lower utility calculations. Critically, CNA found that 83% of E1 to E5 service members with dependents at Naval Base Guam who live off base were renting larger units than the BAH standard and no out-of-pocket expense. For example, OHA enabled larger, more expensive units. That is powerful Guam-specific evidence that if BHA replaces OHA, a large share of junior and mid-grade service members will have both motive and opportunity to move into smaller, cheaper units, again, the same inventory that most civilians rent. 5, safety and resilience. OHA approval inspection process is a real protection on a typhoon-prone island. CNA documents a specific Guam safety concern raised by the 2 military housing offices under OHA. They must approve each service member's residence and inspect to ensure it can withstand typhoons. They warn that many homes do not meet that standard and that under BAH, they might not be able to prevent service members from choosing cheap, unsafe dwellings. GAR believes Guam should not advocate for a policy shift and that could unintentionally increase occupancy of substandard units, undermine resilience, and create preventable risks for service families and the broader community. 6, even CNA warns Guam is uniquely hard to price for BHA, and getting it wrong can destabilize both civilian and military housing. CNA explains that because landlords can price determine and service members dominate the market for military appropriate housing, a normal market price may not currently exist on Guam, and therefore it may not be possible to reliably calculate a future BHA rate using standard assumptions. They warn that setting the wrong initial BAH rate can have undesirable effects, and note that because of BHA rate protection, an initial rate that is too high can remain expensive for years. If too low, it can disrupt the private housing market and drive service members back to base, potentially causing waiting lines, especially during planned force movements. CNA also reports that at this time of analysis, military occupancy was only 55% in on-base family housing and 66% in permanent party bachelor housing, evidence that Guam's military housing system and local market are already in a delicate balance. In short, Guam's market is too constrained and too atypical to treat an OHA to BHA transition as a simple administrative fix. 7, supply constraints mean the island cannot absorb a surge of military demand in the workforce market. Resolution 117-38 states GURA estimated roughly 9,908 additional housing units needed by 2025, and notes planned military expansion, including the estimated 2,400 incoming personnel units, will further strain limited housing supply. In a market with near 99% occupancy and large unit shortfalls, GAR believes it would be irresponsible to promote a policy change that predictably drives thousands of financially advantaged renters, because they can pocket BHA differences, into the same price band as local civilians. GAR's position and request: GAR respectfully urges the committee and the legislature to 1, reject Resolution 117-38 to the extent it calls for transitioning Guam from OHA to BHA, and 2, advocate instead for solutions that address the underlying drivers for Guam's housing crisis, and importantly, increase supply and strengthening the resilience and quality of the rental stock without destabilizing the workforce and market. GAR stands ready to work with the legislature, GURA, and federal partners on the practical driven strategies that expand housing options for Guam residents while maintaining safe, military-appropriate housing standards and preserving stability in the housing market. Signed Amasi, respectfully submitted by Claire Delgado, 2026 President of the Guam Association of Realtors. Sizus Ma'ase.
Thank you so much for your testimony, sir. And then we are going down the line to my colleague and good friend here. Please, for the record, state your name and go ahead and have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Senator Parkinson. Senator Perez, my name is Fernando Esteves, Deputy Director of the Guam Housing and Urban Renewal Authority, here testifying in my official capacity in support of this resolution. I apologize, I didn't have time to draw up written testimony, so I'll do my best to articulate. Senator, you've done a great job outlining a lot of the background and the various differences of OHA and BAH. A couple things to add. BAH also requires annually that a study be conducted. The purpose of BAH expressed in DOD 700.14-R, Financial Management Regulation, states that the purpose of BAH is to analyze the market to make sure that the service members, one, can get affordable, decent housing that's suitable for them, but also that it's not disruptive. So they analyze it and compare service members to the workforce. That's part and built into BAH, as opposed to OHA, which completely is devoid of any analysis as to local market conditions. I would propose and posit to the committee and the legislature that much of the skewed data is specifically because of BAH. Now, the renters and military renters don't exist in a different market. The entire market of real estate is based on comparables. So the more they spend, it changes the median, it changes the average, and rents follow. It's an endless cycle of artificial inflation. You hit the nail on the head. This is really a matter of fair market and competition, which is what this nation is built on. And what you have is a monopoly. We call it a market, but there's no market. While we share a market, it'd be different if, let's say, all of the military data was completely separate from the rest of Guam's data when it comes to renters. And if we're determining the fair market price of renters for Guam, it completely excludes all military renters. That'd be maybe something we can work with. But when the data skews, it becomes a problem, particularly with GURA. And so when we have to analyze, we have to go based on the data that's out there, the rental, what people are paying for rent, military or not. And so when not military. And so when the rates go up, even for locals paying that, it affects our FMR. The FMR is often misunderstood as the most GURA can pay, but actually what the FMR, the fair market rent, is that we published every year, represents the total shelter cost plus utility allowance that we are legally able to pay. And so rents are going to be much lower than that amount. And so, they often confuse that our rents are in competition or comparable to military OHA. That's not the case at all. The problem with that, Senators, we have a limited budget that we can provide for our Section 8 vouchers. As rent constantly, in this never-ending cycle of inflation caused by the Overseas Housing Allowance and supply and demand, increases the base and average and medium rents. And so when we have to adjust our FMR higher and when we pay out more for rents, we're not able to maximize the voucher allocation that we have from HUD. So for example, we're able to issue out 2,700 vouchers. We can only issue up to what our budget can sustain. And so we have vouchers sitting on the table. That's why today, because rents have continually gone up, that GURA has paused for a little more than 6 months now, issuing new Section 8 vouchers, because our projections show that the budget can't sustain it. This is a very real thing. So there's money left on the table. The idea about this change is to stop this artificial inflation, to create a fair market. It's perfectly fine. We don't oppose that military renters compete in a fair and open market with the local community. That's how any market should be. There should be no skewing. There should be no monopoly. I think one of the key things, and we've understood, and we've analyzed it and considered feedback too, that inflation does play a part in the cost of operating, renting, and being the landlord for housing. But I can say, as GURA, who is the landlord and owner of over 800 units that we lease, if not the largest landlord on the island, it does play a role, but it's not the most significant role. Inflation in terms of maintenance, repairs, capital improvements is not the biggest issue. So our primary support for the resolution is to ensure that there is a fair market. One of the big issues is that Department of Defense, and we've been working with them to update their policy, has no right-sizing requirement. So in the definition, when you say a service member with dependent, could be a service member with one child, a service member who's married, with enough money to rent a modest home in one of the villages, a 3-bedroom home. They have no right sizing requirement, whereas we do. Meanwhile, we have families of 3, 4, 5 cannot find a 3-bedroom living in the jungle. We need to have a good working relationship with Department of Defense. And besides the OHA and BAH issue, there are very immediate policy decisions and determinations they can make today, such as right sizing requirements. One of the reports was an OHA rental in Agate, not a high-end unit, as may have been proposed. And that's at maybe the point of the CNA that was the case. But today, supply and demand is such a huge issue that they're taking anything. And to the service member, it's monopoly money. It's use or lose. It does not matter. And what you see are price increases above the BAH of $5, $10, where the service member will pay $5 out of pocket, $10 out of pocket. But what that does, as you mentioned, to the 80th percentile, that's going to push next year the OHA even higher. And that's why you see this perpetual inflation. This is intentional. And there's no hard feelings of that. Business is business. But you are correct, Senator. The system is broken. OHA by design, and you can review that in the FMR, and it has not changed, is meant for foreign countries, service members in foreign countries where they have to deal with very different laws around real estate and land. But more importantly, currency exchange, different values in currency. That is not the case on Guam at all. And what was not specifically pointed out in the CNA report was that when comparing Guam to the territories, Guam has an overwhelming number of military presence here. There's no comparison in any of the territories. You can refer to a 2024, I believe, GAO report that concluded that rent destabilization was much more prevalent and higher in concentrations of cities and towns with a military presence. That's about threefold what's occurring on Guam. We need BAH partly that DOD becomes a partner in analyzing, as per the FMR, the market every year to make sure the disruption is limited. I've said this on the record many times. The advocacy for the military to build more housing or put them on the base is primarily because of the Overseas Allowance. If Congress were to change and designate Guam not as overseas for the purposes of housing allowance, and DOD follow on with the policy, then we become one market. We truly become one market. We become a more cohesive community where it's not the haves and the have-nots. And that's a very real situation of here. That's very pro-service member. Additionally, when you consider how we're looking, or some would consider the economic benefits of having the service member here, OHA runs counter to that. It's monopoly money, use or lose it's a one-trick pony. Meanwhile, as inflation goes up artificially on rents for every single person, every business owner, everybody in the workforce, as their rents go up as a result of the military renters, they're having to raise their rates. They're having to charge more. They're having to clamor for raises, increasing the cost of business for every other industry but one. That is a very real concern in terms of the economic prosperity. When you're looking at economic growth, everybody should be rising. But when you have one particular segment through the roof, that should raise concern. And it's not a matter of what we're doing here or what they're doing. It's not meant, it is the system that was not designed for the situation that we are in. And asking for a realistic look is not irrational. And what the CNA reported out is, sure, with any change, there's pros and cons. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't need to be studied. That doesn't mean that it shouldn't be looked into. That shouldn't mean that there shouldn't be advocacy that something needs to change, because it is broken. You see it. You see the rate of inflation over the last 10 years. What sticks out? While it's happened around the other country, what stuck out with Guam? I think one thing that many are not familiar with is, although the record of decision came out for the marine relocation, within the 10-year time, or less than 10-year time, 8 to 9 years, you saw 1,000 to 2,000 additional workers above the projection, H2, an unknown number of contractors coming up, needing housing as well, and approximately 2,500 service members and their families permanently relocated to Guam outside of the military buildup, unstudied, unmitigated, uncoordinated, thrown BAH and thrown out to the community, completely outside the NEPA process, as was reported to Congress. Before the buildup ever even came, we never stood a chance. The people of Guam never stood a chance when you throw that kind of money. That's gentrification by definition. That's exactly what it is. Throw a bunch of people in a community with a lot of money and people get pushed down. People are already pushed downward. People who could otherwise afford a moderate unit, a decent unit, are pushed out for a higher price tag. It's already happening. They've been affecting workforce housing for the last 10 years. And that's not a blame on anyone. That's not a blame on the realtors or anything. That's a supply and demand issue. Promises were made at the time. Whoever was involved in the buildup, that was well before my time. I wasn't even on island. I was still in Iraq and Afghanistan. We were so confident we could keep up with it. We were so confident things didn't need to change. We were so confident we don't, if it's not broken, don't fix it. It's broken. We know that now. We cannot repeat with the buildup continuing on. We cannot repeat the cycle of apathy. At the end of the day, things were in transition. Some people won. Some people won out very big. Some people are still winning out. But something needs to change, because the people of Guam need a win. People of Guam need some stability. People of Guam need some reassurance that they can work, have a job, get an education, and have a chance at a life here. It's a matter of policy. I was there. I received BH. We're both veterans here. And thinking about it, if I were receiving OHA and because of my rank, I'm a single person, I can get a 3-bedroom house, and you're just giving me all that. Meanwhile, there's a family that could fit that house appropriately living in the jungle. Yeah, that wouldn't sit well with me. As of 2024, about 80% of Department of Defense personnel was living outside the base. Again, this is not a matter of us versus them. But what OHA does is it creates a situation of the haves and have-nots. That is not the purpose laid out in the financial management regulation. There are still questions that I've had on the efficacy of enforcement. That $10,000, I don't know if I mentioned, the modest unit was a service member with one dependent who was stacking, renting one room out for another $2,500, another room out for another $2,500. The rent on that at that one address was over $10,000 paid by the federal government. Pursuant to the financial management regulation, it's specific to OHA that it should not be used for personal enrichment. But what do we see here? Subletting with no business license to our own people on the federal government's dime. That's not what the design is. That's not what we need to be. We do need to be a cohesive community, and we need to start by having a fair, free, and open market for everybody who's on island. So, subject to your question, Senator, that's all I have at this time.
Thank you very much for your testimony, sir. And now, moving on to my other good friend, please introduce yourself for the audience at home and for the record with your name and title and who you're representing.
Hafide Guausi Melvin Wampat Borja. I'm the Executive Director of the Commission on Decolonization. Good morning, Senator Parkinson and Senator Perez. Thank you for allowing me to provide testimony on Resolution 117-38. On behalf of the Commission on Decolonization, I am submitting the following testimony regarding Resolution 117-38. COD provides its support for the resolution and its call to the U.S. Congress and the Department of Defense to utilize the Basic Allowance for housing as opposed to the Overseas Housing Allowance for military service personnel and their dependents. The introduction of this resolution is timely as our island is facing an ongoing and ever-increasing military buildup. As we are currently witnessing, the population of military service members, their dependents, and federal and military contractors is increasing, which may amount to an estimated 35,052 by 2037. The increase in Guam's military population can be attributed to the opening of Marine Corps Base Camp Blas, a decade-long program of air and land missile tests on our island, and the construction and implementation of a 360-degree missile defense system across existing military installations on Guam. As acknowledged in the final environmental impact statement for the Enhanced Integrated Air and Missile Defense System, quote, if the construction of housing units continues at this rate, any additional demand in the coming years would further exacerbate the housing shortage on Guam, end quote. An increase in demand for housing is anticipated to lead to a, quote, increase in home sale prices and rental prices, end quote. Notably, the OHA for an E1, the lowest enlisted rank, with dependents as of January 1st of this year totaled up to $4,859. This number is inclusive of the monthly OHA rental allowance, $2,450, the monthly utility recurring maintenance allowance, $1,586, and the move-in housing allowance, which is $823. The OHA predominantly applies to countries across the world which are designated as foreign jurisdictions as opposed to the BAH, which applies to the continental U.S. and the states of Hawaii and Alaska. Although they are not foreign entities, the OHA applies to Guam and the other 4 unincorporated territories. The application of OHA to Guam is one of many indicators of how our island is viewed and treated by the U.S. federal government, where Guam is foreign in a domestic sense. This is a paradoxical statement in nature, but it's aptly applied to our island because of our political status. Our local government and people remain in a disadvantaged position, subject to the whims and unilateral authority of the U.S. federal government. It can be argued that the use of the OHA on Guam is a primary factor in the rising cost of living and housing affordability for our island's people. This is amongst other consequences of continued U.S. colonization and militarization of our island, which has exacerbated the conditions that have made it more difficult for our people to make ends meet. Unfortunately, these challenges have led to an exodus of our island's population, most especially Guam's indigenous Tamoto people, who migrate to seek better economic opportunities elsewhere. Although it may not be explicitly seen, the continued displacement of the Tamoto people serves to the benefit of the U.S. from being made accountable to their obligations to assist in facilitating a genuine act of self-determination for our people. Although the effort of the resolution's primary sponsor is commendable, it is yet another measure of mitigation that our government is taking to respond to the military buildup. Our island continues to lack actual representation within federal government and with one non-voting delegate in the House of Representatives. Having genuine representation with influence through voting power would have actual influence in making the Department of Defense utilize the BAH as opposed to the OHA for military service members and their dependents. To properly strive toward rectifying the economic and housing issues that our island's people are facing every day requires a genuine act of self-determination, leading our island to gaining sovereignty and a full measure of self-government. Through a change in our political status, we will be able to stand on equal footing and genuine partnership with the U.S. federal government. Guam achieving a sovereign status will mean that our government will have the ability to negotiate the terms of a continued U.S. military presence and their activities within and around our island. This resolution, while an important step in underscoring the U.S. military's responsibility in manufacturing socioeconomic disparities in Guam and among its people, is yet another measure of mitigation, a temporary remedy that does not solve the root of the housing crisis issue at large. Dismantling these structural barriers that disempower our community and threaten their livelihoods are only possible through an act of self-determination toward decolonization and achieving a full measure of self-government. Sejus Masi for your time.
Thank you very much for your testimony. At this time, I'd like to open up the floor to questions or comments from my colleagues. I'd like to recognize Senator Sabina Paris. Thank you for coming, and the floor is yours, ma'am. Take as much time as you need.
Thank you so much, Senator Parkinson, and thank you to all that have come here to provide testimony. Yes, and I am I'm very concerned about the housing cost on Guam, especially in light of the recent RFP that was released by the Rear Admiral, in which it seems like there's been a policy shift where, at least in the beginning, there was talk about on-base housing, increasing the amount of stock of housing on base, and now it's evolved to looking for housing off base, in which they're looking at the central part of Guam. And so what we're seeing now is people's rents are being increased to the OHA levels. And that's something that has been predicted or has been going on for some time, but now we're seeing people that are fleeing Guam. It's really undermining the fabric dramatically. This recent RFP is really undermining the fabric of our society, where people are fleeing the island because they can't afford. Before, they were paying even what they were paying for rent was upwards to 50% of what they were getting. And now with the increase, they can't afford this $2,500 rent and more. And so I think, you know, I appreciate the testimony by Deputy Esteves of how the BAH can help mitigate this. And so it's really concerning. Actually, the silence is deafening coming from the military in how they are going to respond to this. And if I can read into the record of decision for the Military Defense Agency. And so on August 15th, and I can provide this to you to include in the committee report. On August 15th, the governor and lieutenant governor of Guam submitted a letter to the MDA director responding to the EIAMD system on Guam, final EIS on behalf of the people of Guam and the government of Guam. The letter indicates the final EIS does not sufficiently address cumulative impacts on Guam's infrastructure, public services, economy, and natural and cultural resources, noting 2 reports issued in 2025 by the U.S. Government Accountability Office. So it goes on to state, while neither of these GOA reports were specifically addressed in the final EIS, we reviewed the reports and determined they provide no new information or data. And the report's conclusion were based on significantly upon same available information. So they refuse to look at cumulative impacts. As we all know, there are many military projects going on. You know, we have the Marine relocation, we have the Missile Defense Agency, we have the 2008 Navy projects, we have, you know, the THAAD, so many different projects going on here. And yet they refuse to look at the cumulative impacts. But yet we are experiencing these cumulative impacts. The record of decision goes on to state that they will rotate service members so it does not impact the community until the time they can produce a sufficient amount of housing stock. And that is not basically what's happening, is that this document is being breached. We're seeing that the military, even when they provide some statement of that they're going to mitigate, they are not mitigating it to what they have decided on this record of decision document. But even at that, In order to address these cumulative impacts, I really support this transition from an Overseas Housing Allowance to a Basic Allowance for housing for the very same reasons that you mentioned, Deputy Esteves, that there is going to be a study, and it provides, it's an avenue to create fair market when we're experiencing a speculative market. So Guam is bearing the brunt, the people of the locals especially, are bearing the brunt of this speculative market that has no end in sight, with salaries that do not keep up with it. We know the military has deep pockets. Their budgets is, last time I checked, was 7 times more than the next highest country that puts money into the military. And so, you know, as an island, we are called upon to be able to survive this. This is an economic threat that is happening to our community. The military is not only adequately responding to our concerns regarding cumulative impacts, they're not adequately addressing this inflation, the speculative inflation that's due to speculation. And Deputy Esteves, you mentioned that some of these service members, which, you know, obviously need to, the federal regulations need to be enforced, where there's cases where they're using it for their enrichment, which goes against regulations, where they purchase a property, rent it out, and just rake it in. And this is to the detriment to the community. We cannot turn a blind eye on this. This is something that we need to speak out on and hopefully make this change. I mean, there was talk in the last Defense Forum about possibly looking into this transition. So I really believe that this is necessary as far as mitigation to what's happening on our island. And so the question that I have perhaps is, what is the policy now in regards to building on base? I mean, the latest we've heard is that they're looking for off-base housing because it's going to cost $1.2 million to build a single-family home. To me, that seems like questionable, because we know the military. You know, there's other ways of building affordable housing with on base, and with the amount of resources that they have, they can get the best type of competition for, you know, these companies that are coming that want to get contracts, military contracts. So it kind of really, the question is, how is that possible? And so if they're looking off base, it seems to me that they're trying to, of course, the only way that they can do it cheaper is if they're displacing somebody versus trying to build something. Of course, displacing a housed family versus trying to construct something, which would be, in my book, probably more, they would probably get a more competitive price, considering that they can pay, considering that they have a bigger reach. And so I think this is an important policy decision. I'm sure there are many reports out there by the government that have supported this. Yeah, I look forward to this getting on the floor, and the support. I think it's really critical that there needs to be a response, and you know, I think it's telling that there's no response at this point from Joint Region. I mean, this is what we've been used to. We, as a people, have been stating our concerns, which go unaddressed, and there we see things fall apart before our very eyes. And this is not what a democracy is based on. Democracy should listen to the people, respond to the needs of the people, and not turn a blind eye. And so I think this is very telling. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator. I got a few questions for members of the panel. It was the testimonies, sir, that if we were to switch over to the basic housing allowance, that would cause a flight, because you testified that the military currently occupies the high-end rental housing. Is that correct?
Could you repeat that, please?
So you testified earlier that the military, they occupy high-end rental housing, and that if we were to switch over to the basic housing allowance, we would see a flight from that high-end rental housing towards middle-income housing, towards the 1,200, 1,300
Yes, I
range.
did say that, because your OHA gives you, let's just pick a figure, depending on your rank, $2,200, $2,500 a month, plus $1,300 for maintenance and utilities, or $1,600 if you're married on top of that. So you either rent a place of that value or you don't get that amount of money. So if they were to rent, say, a $1,500 unit, they would get $1,500. But they could go up to their maximum. So they, as a realtor, I could tell you that 90+% end up at the top end, and many of them will throw additional money into it because they want the view, to be on the beach, or something attracts them that they don't mind putting other things into it. Now, Basic Allowance for Housing, you get that amount if you rent for that amount. So you get whatever, $1,500. Now, if you rent for less, so you rent for $1,000, you pocket $500. So now you're putting the service member in a position that they're renting what my 200 employees that make substantially less than the military, they have that income to rent, can't compete with that, because now the market is being depleted by BAH. It'll be devastating for the island, and I'm very surprised to hear these gentlemen to my right advocating for BAH. It's just going to be an absolute devastation to the island if we go from OHA, because that part, I can tell you, there is nobody, including myself in my company, that can compete and rent at what OHA allows them. And our clients that we're representing as we're renting their properties, they built these substantially well-constructed homes for the sole purpose of renting to people on OHA. And the inspector from the housing office comes out, and they're strict. If your smoke detectors aren't working, you're not getting that. You're not renting to them. If you don't have the doors properly, the electrical property, the fire alarms aren't anything wrong, the window sizes, I had to change all the windows for one of my clients to larger sizes in Barragata Heights. A substantial cost, so he could rent to the military. There's a lot of safety factors. At BAH, there's no inspection. So we take our war-fighting personnel that are keeping the safety of the U.S. the way it is. We're going to allow them to go in substandard housing that's not inspected at all. And as cheap as they have, and pocket the difference. So when they do a 3-year, 2-year tour here, they could leave and say, wow, I got my pay, and I pocketed an extra $20,000 while I was there. That was pretty slick, Oh, but the place blew away when we had a typhoon, But I just rented a different place after that. We got to look out not just for ourselves, but those people inside the gates, our family, to us. This is one island. We got to take care of all of us, and I hope that answered your question.
Okay, you had something to say, sir? Go ahead.
Yeah, and respectfully, I do take exception at this characterization that if you're not a military renter or expected by the JRM housing office, that somehow all the people living on Guam are living in slums under slumlords, like we don't have codes, like we don't have occupancy inspections, like we don't have fire inspections. It's a ridiculous notion. And again, you know, with over 2,700 vouchers and inspectors that inspect every property, you know, I can tell you that that's not the case. I don't think that's I mean, I don't want to comment too much on his comment, but I just don't want to create alarm to the public that somehow if you're a non-military renter, you know, you're living in the slums of Guam. I don't think that's a fair or appropriate characterization of our island. You know, I'd like to continue. I don't, you know, we talk about the service member, but give the service member a choice. They're a responsible adult. They are a war fighter. And if their personal choice is that they need to pocket that extra $1,000 to, I don't know, put their kid to private school or do this or do that or pay aside for the education, help mom and dad back out at home, let them make that choice. Let them have that money to make that choice. I was in those shoes. Yeah, so if they choose to live in a cheaper place, that's their priority. That's their prerogative. Give it to them. They're not, so what are they? Are they warriors to be honored or are they children? It's an easy fix. That can be addressed in COLA and everybody wins. If the current BAH is $2,400, I mean OHA is $2,400 and we set it to $1,400, give them $1,000 in COLA. Let them be the deciding factor. Whether they want to pay for that beachfront property or they want to keep the money, go on a trip with their family, spend money in the local economy. Let them have the choice. It's all about fair market. But what we're talking about here is a use-or-lose slush fund for a one-trick pony, a one thing. It does one thing. But, you know, to characterize it, here's the other thing to consider. It's the other half of that, right? What happens when the service member does decide to find a place more competitive, more aligned with what their financial goals and interests are? You think the expectation is that that unit that they were living in before is going to stay empty? What happens when something is underutilized? What happens when product is left on the shelf for 1 year with no one buying it? The price drops. That's how you deflate. Competition, saturation. That's tried and true. That's how you deflate the market. Now we still have, and I'm sure we find a lot of common ground, that there's still very much supply issues. But with no incentive and no competition, there's not going to be any deflation. That's the other side of it. Yeah, people will come down. Yes, people will make financial choices for them and their families to live in a more expensive place or to live in a less expensive place. But I'll tell you right now, units are not going to sit empty. Nobody that built, whether by speculation, took a gamble, which is their own choice, their own risk, on something that was not for sure. They're the ones that have to answer to the bank. So they're either going to take some loss, break even, reinvest, or maybe sell to a family ready to buy. All that cycling, that's the circle of life. That is a market. What we're talking about is a healthy market. That's what we want to head to. Absolutely, we're advocating for that. But the status quo is not going to work. Our island is dying. The 2020 census, our middle income, our middle class, those between 80 to 100% area median income are near non-existent. You're either below the threshold or you're living large. That is the direction we're heading, and it all starts with housing. That's why we're passionate about it. There's zero incentive for us. It's all about housing. It all starts from housing. If you don't have a place to call your own, everything else starts to fall apart, whether it's the land or the feet or the home you're living in. All we're asking for is a fair market. We're not even going, you know, I mean, I don't want to go off topic, but we're not even advocating for crazy policy form like rent control. You want to talk something destructive? Any one of you senators can get 7 other votes and put rent control. We're not here advocating for that. That would surely help us. in maximizing our budget and our vouchers, but we're not advocating for that. We're advocating for reason. But surely there are nuclear options, and I'll tell you, converting OHA to BAH is not a nuclear option. The sky is not going to fall. It is going to create fair, free, and open competition for everybody calling Guam home, whether you're military, federal employee, government of Guam worker, or private sector employee. That's what I want to add in. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you. I want to follow up actually on some of those points you made, sir. You talk about the devastation that we would have switching over system. Could you expand a little bit about that? What kind of devastation are we like?
Yeah, right now I can take out, say, my employees. They're all middle class, I would say, and I could show them from the multiple listing service hundreds of available units. And if, like Saturday, one of my realtors took out 3 military people, showed them 19 different places. They're, of course, all OHA people. So there seems to be adequate housing for people in OHA. And even though we say that the market is short on housing, and we all agree to that, but there is housing. I can show them in almost every village on the island places that they could rent. It's their choice what to rent. So if we take those OHA people and we put them in to this other category with the local middle-class residents, now we're going to you're going to eat them all up. It's going to be tough.
What makes the housing at that level substandard?
It's not necessarily substandard, but I'm reaching for the extreme when I say because it's not inspected, it's not required to be inspected at the BHH. And I don't know why. It just isn't. Now, I maintain my company, because I'm a maintenance company and a real estate company, a housing area for a developer that has over 700 houses. Most of them, I believe, are rented through GURA. GURA has an inspection system that is every bit as stressful or rigid as the military housing offices. They can't move in tenants if it doesn't, and get vouchers from GURA if they don't pass GURA muster. And it's a checklist, yay long. And you better have all those things, and it's almost identical to what the military housing inspectors look for in OHA housing inspections. We can't rent OHA housing until it gets inspected and passes.
But how does this lead to devastation?
They don't inspect. GURA doesn't inspect. Military housing office doesn't inspect. So you get what you get.
But how does this lead to the devastation of our island?
Oh, we have this segment of houses available now. And it may be tight, but there's housing out there to rent. Now we're going to take these people and we're going to put them into this section. Now they're going to be taken. And the competition, now we're competing. My employees, I just use them as an example, are competing against a military renter. Well, the military renter is now in a high income position, renting homes in the $2,000 to $3,000 range, and that's not where the middle class Guamanian is renting.
But what will happen to those $2,000 to $3,000 homes? Are they still going to stay $2,000 to $3,000 if all the military money is flooding to the?
It's good. That's a very good question.
What happens to those $2,000 to $3,000 homes?
If we can't pay our debt service, if you can't pay your debt service on rentals that you have there because you made that investment, because you knew if you built a $500,000 house, you would get military renters with OHA. You could meet your debt service to the financial institution to finance it. You're okay. Now you switch to BAH. Now you're going to go in possibly to foreclosures all over this island.
But what happens to the price of those houses, though? Like, what happens if we switch to the price? So all these people move from the high-end housing to the $1,200 to $1,300 housing. What happens to the price of this housing up there?
I see what you're getting at, but I'm not an appraiser, but we can all speculate that, well,
Well, how does it threaten?
You still have the debt service. The
Yes,
debt,
so
no matter
how is
what
the-
you
how
think
is
the
the-
value of the house is.
How is the debt service threatened?
How does it what?
How is the debt service threatened?
Resident.
How is the debt service of the house threatened by switching to the BHA system?
Oh, it's not going to be rented, the BHA, because it's not going to come close to. You can't give a BHA of $1,500 to a house that you have a mortgage of $2,000, $2,500 or something. You got to pay the bank every month. There's going to sometime down the road, it's going to collapse. You're going to financially collapse.
Okay, and so what happens to that asset when it gets financially collapsed? It gets
Well,
foreclosed?
it goes into foreclosure.
And what happens in foreclosure?
But foreclosure,
It's
you know,
sold
they
to somebody
hire
else?
a company like us to maintain it until it can be sold on the open market and a bidding. But the financial institution puts it up for bid, and the minimum bid has to be whatever it is, and it may not get sold because there's no market for it. The market for that house has gone away. So it could sit there in perpetuity and never, it just whittle away. So we have all these upper income homes that people spend $500,000 on that are going to sit empty.
So instead of lowering prices, people would just let these properties go fallow. Is that the testimony?
I don't know. I'd have to think on my property because I invested a lot of money to bring it up to the standards that the military wanted to get it, and I mean a lot of money.
Because it
And
seems
if I don't recoup it, I'm not sure what I could do about it. You could try to sell it, but who's going to buy it? Because of what are you going to do with it unless you're buying it for your own single-family home to live in?
You know, I've always believed in the process of business that, you know, the government should not pick winners and losers. We should have a strong free market, and that when businesses collapse from the ashes, something stronger will rise from what comes before. You know, I've always been a big believer in removing incentives for moral hazard in our communities, because if people do not fear the negative incentives, it just leads to a very fast and loose position with gambling with assets, gambling with the public trust, without any sort of fear of responsibility, because they know that they are going to be stopgapped. And so I don't like this idea of floors being set in our rental markets, where the floors are so high that is dragging the average cost of housing much higher. I'd like to ask you, former Senator, what you were talking about taxpayer funds towards housing, and how with the maximum plus $5 and the maximum plus $10, every year it's stretching and inflating the cost of housing. Could you please expound upon that point a little bit more? I thought that was a very fascinating point.
So, you know, as you said it, right, based on the FMR and the CNA report, they take the 80th percentile based on actual costs. And so every inch they're going to look at that and they're going to see inflation, and it's going to automatically trigger an increase in OHA, so long as they're consistent with it. So how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time? So how do you creep up, or how do you get a higher base or floor on OHA? Because they only give them a certain amount based on reimbursement, so you have to get the service member to pay out of pocket. So, there's a lot of talk about supporting the service members, but a lot of them do pay out of the pocket. Not big amounts, but one little bite out of that elephant. $10 more than the other guy. Oh, I've been a family transitioning and moving from place to place. It's very stressful. The pressure of your spouse either wanting to fly over or wanting to move in and get settled into their home right away, that's a lot of pressure. So if you say, hey, for $10 more, this place can be yours, they're signed on that dotted line. And you know what that's going to do? It's going to change the floor the next year, and then the next year. Because they don't care. Because in their mind, all I'm paying for this place is $10 a month. It's monopoly money to them. I'm not in a negative way, but it truly is. It's of no consequence except that $10 they're adding in, or $15 or $50 for that beautiful view that they sold, that beachfront property. But what that does, the consequence of that to everybody else, is it's not monopoly money. That $3,000, that $4,000 rental funded by the federal government is not monopoly. That turns into real consequences for everybody else who doesn't have the subsidy. To your line of questioning, Senator, I do want to share, I think it was just today that President Trump signed an executive order banning institutional investors, Wall Street in particular, from buying up homes. This is, I think a great move in terms of trying to right-size the housing market in America, but we should take note of that for Guam. Developers aren't meant to be landlords for all of these places. They're meant to develop the home, sell it, move on to the next thing. But what you're seeing here is everybody is this mass holding these empires. The American dream is where the family owns the home. Their name is on that dotted line. They're not everybody in America is a renter to an overlord. Serfdom went away a long time ago. So congrats to President Trump on trying to right size, the housing market in America. I think it's a great move, but it's the same concept. So I'll answer your question. What happens when the lease or the leases, the mortgages, flip and go under and they can't afford to pay it? It goes back to the bank. The bank will option it. The bank's going to try to make their money back. And in the circle of life, somebody who needs a home, who can afford that, because we have a huge pent-up demand, right? Where it's maybe $100,000 cheaper from what it was, originally marketed for, what it was being sold for, will buy that home and they'll have a home to raise their family and call Guam home. What's going to happen is people who relocated because they didn't have a chance, people with education, middle-class professionals who didn't have a chance at owning or having a life on Guam, having a chance to come back and participate and live here on Guam and raise their family here. That's what you're going to see. It's not that I'm heartless to the investment and business that business has made, this and that, but it was all based on speculation. Look, you gamble, there's winners, there's losers, but you're right. It's not the government's job to pick who wins and who loses. All we're advocating for is a fair, free, and open market for everybody. We just need our people of Guam and our people to have a chance. They stand no chance right now. That is a numerical reality.
That's a reality I feel. I feel it because, I'm not sure if the people of Guam know this, but I think I might be the only legislator in this entire chamber who rents. I might be the only one. And I could tell you, as a millennial, as somebody coming up in this world, I ain't even thinking about owning a house. It's just so far out of reach for me and for people in my cohort. I went to my 20-year reunion recently, and a majority of the people at my 20-year reunion, people coming up on their 40s, are gonna be perpetual lifetime renters because they cannot afford the housing. I remember when I moved here back on Guam in, halcyon days of 2012. That time I was still a single man. I loved exploring the nightlife of our wonderful island, and I made a lot of friends with military service members. We would go after party at their place into the wee hours of the morning. And sometimes when, you party too hard, you need to do the most responsible thing and just sleep on a friend's couch. I didn't even have to sleep on a friend's couch. My single military friend had a 3-bedroom house so he could put guest women and guest men in separate rooms. We didn't even have to sit on the couch. This one person was taking up a 3-bedroom house. And I asked him how much he was paying for this place. You know what he told me? I don't know. The military pays for it. This guy had no clue what he was paying for it. No clue. As you said, it's monopoly money. And I can't even fault him. If I was getting a flat amount, I would spend all of it. I worked in the federal government for 10 years, and I've seen what use it or lose it policies do to budgeting. People aren't trying to become more efficient. They are trying to spend every single dollar so they do not lose any of it, with no care for or consideration for best price points or saving the taxpayer's dollar or even saving themselves any money, because they ain't paying it. They ain't paying it. And I've always looked at freedom as one of my enduring North Stars in politics. Free markets, exchange of ideas, exchange of goods, a world based on rules and laws. And we've seen in this world that economic policies can be used as a weapon. And it is very telling that in all other 50 states, my people of Guam, in all other 50 states, we use the Basic Housing Allowance. Every other rational actor out there, every other state has looked at this internally, individually, separate from every other state, and said to themselves, this is a system we prefer over the other one. Every single state. And they use the Basic Housing Allowance. We use the Overseas Housing Allowance. Overseas. I take the point of my friend in the Office of Decolonization very, very strongly, that we are treated foreign in the domestic sense. Why are we, Americans, being treated with an overseas program meant for foreigners that takes no care or account for what it does to distort the local markets? Because that's what I see. I see distortion in our local markets. How can they not be distorted? We talk about housing at $1,100 to $1,300 a month, but what would the price of that housing be if the average wasn't dragged up by the OHA? And I agree with my colleague here that there are other nuclear options. There are things like price controls. I'm as progressive as they come. I'm Team Bernie Sanders over here. So I understand what kind of tools we have in the toolbox. And I'm asking for the most basic one, a free and open, fair market. Something both sides should be able to get with. And I hope that this doesn't turn into a partisan red versus blue thing, because this is the housing of our island. This is the housing of our island. It shouldn't be partisan. We all live here. We all deal with it. Well, not all of us deal with this problem. A majority of this legislature probably owns their own house. But as somebody who is a renter themselves, I see the impossibility of finding housing on this island, and it's dire. It's dire. And I don't think this is going to fix the problem, but I think it is going to add a downward pressure on prices. That is what happens when you introduce competition. You get lower prices and you get greater quality across the board. That is a bedrock economic principle. We should not be here picking winners and losers. We should not be enfeoffing some portions of the community at the expense of others. You know what happens if a soldier finds a $1,200 home when he's getting $2,500 in allowance? That means he has $1,300 to spend on the community. on diapers, on milk, on water, on food, on amenities that they could be circulating in the community instead of just going straight into housing. And I want to bring this one back to freedom once again, because I don't believe freedom just regards your rights or what you can and can't do, but also the material conditions we live in. If we are spending all of our wages just to pay for our housing and we have nothing left for ourselves, what are we really working for? We're not living. We're doing our best to survive. There's no thriving in that situation. People are just trying to keep their head above water. The American dream is owning the home. If switching to the BHA leads to lower pressures, leads to across the board lower prices for housing, I'll take that. I'll take that. And if it does lead to foreclosures, that is part of the circle of life. That is the part of the circle of life. From things that collapse, something greater rises. It is survival of the fittest, the law of the jungle. And so I hope and I wish, and I'm disappointed that more of my colleagues aren't here to talk about and discuss this resolution. Housing is one of the most important issues in our island. I will never forget that the last event I went to before COVID happened, I remember I was at some fundraiser over in Tumon, and we were talking about going into lockdowns for 2 weeks, and I remember the last question somebody asked me before we went down into lockdowns. A young teacher came up to me and said, "Oh, I saw that you ran before, and I know that you're gonna run again. What are you gonna do about housing?" And that was in early March of 2020. And I think about that we're 5 years on and housing has not improved. In some ways it's gotten worse or harder. Things have gotten more expensive. Inflation across the board is just destroying our cost of living and our way of life. And as we are witnessing the change in the global order, we need to get away from the Overseas Housing Allowance, which is a housing allowance used for foreign countries with no care for what it does to their local economy. Let us switch to the BHA, the Basic Housing Allowance that we use for every American service member across every state. We're not looking to reinvent the wheel. We're not looking to do anything brand new. I just want to go back to free and open markets so that our people aren't having to flee the home that they grew up in, that they choose to want to live in if they had the choice. And if this leads to a downward pressure on the high-end housing, I think that's a great thing. Families of 3 or 4 deserve to have good housing. The best of the best housing. Where is it written that the best of the best housing has to go to the military only? Why are we catering so hard to that demographic when we should be looking at new young families as the future nucleus of our island? If we cannot make houses affordable for our young families, then we are not going to have young families. We are going to have an aging population with not enough young people to support them, as happens in every developed nation where they price out the cost of living for the new generation. I feel bad for our new generation. They look so much older and so much tired because they are working 2 to 3 jobs to live in tiny boxes. So, I kind of got off a tangent there, so thank you all for coming to my TED Talk. But I think, unless my colleague, Senator, has any other questions or follow-up, I'm going to consider that this resolution has been heard. For any other testimony to be turned in, it could be turned into the Suite 905 at the DNA building. We will be accepting testimony regarding this issue, and I hope to hear from it soon. Thank you, everybody, for coming in today. I really appreciate your testimony on this very important conversation. Bill Well, resolution has been heard, and this public hearing is adjourned. Thank you.